Right now, as Europe enters another dangerous heat season, Copernicus and the World Meteorological Organization say the continent is warming about twice as fast as the global average. That number should stop the room. Europe is often imagined as protected by stone buildings, public medicine, engineered transport, and governments that can warn people before disaster arrives. But heat does not need to tear roofs away to become deadly. It only has to stay. It stays in bedrooms after midnight. It stays in train platforms, care homes, hospital corridors, construction sites, and apartments where the air never truly resets. And while the continent warms faster than any other on Earth, the European Environment Agency reports that only 21 of the 38 EEA countries have heat health action plans in place. But that is not the most frightening part. The missing plan is not just missing paperwork. It is a missing trigger system for human survival. Who gets warned? Who gets checked on? Who stops working? Which hospitals prepare? Which cities open cooling spaces? And which people are left to endure the heat alone? So this is no longer only a climate story. It is a system story. What happens when the climate moves faster than the institutions built to protect human life? Viewers who want this investigation to continue can like, subscribe, and comment with the place where they live, because the map of heat is no longer distant. Across Europe, the first people to meet the heat are not the people who write the plans. They are the ones who cannot leave the exposure. They are older residents in upper-floor apartments where the walls hold the previous day like a stored fever. They are care home workers opening windows before sunrise, hoping the building will release enough heat before the next afternoon begins. They are nurses moving through corridors where every patient is already vulnerable before the weather adds one more burden. They are construction workers pouring concrete under a sun that turns helmets into small ovens. They are delivery riders waiting at traffic lights over black asphalt that radiates heat upward into their legs. They are farm workers in fields where the nearest shade may be farther away than the next task. They are children in schools built for a climate that assumed summer would end before the building became dangerous. And they are people living alone. That matters because heat is not always dramatic from the outside. A flood has a line on a wall, a wildfire has smoke, a storm has broken glass, fallen trees, and cameras pointed at the damage. Heat can kill inside a closed room with the curtains drawn. It can move through a city without leaving debris in the street. It can turn an ordinary bedroom into a place where the body spends the whole night trying to recover and fails. This is why the scene unfolding across Europe is more unsettling than a map painted red. The red map is only the visible layer. Under it are lives organized around assumptions that are beginning to fail. Trains are expected to run. Hospitals are expected to absorb emergencies. Cities are expected to warn residents in time. Employers are expected to protect workers. Families are expected to check on the people they love. And somewhere inside those expectations sits one dangerous question. What happens when the heat arrives before the routine does? In a European city, the day may begin normally. Shops lift their shutters, commuters enter stations, buses fill. A retired man walks to buy bread before the worst of the afternoon. A mother takes a child across a square where there are benches but not enough shade. A tourist studies a map, not yet understanding that the stones underfoot are part of the heat system. By noon, the city has changed. Metal handrails are uncomfortable to touch. Bus stops without trees become waiting rooms without walls. Apartment blocks absorb sunlight on one side and release it slowly through the evening. The city is no longer just a place where heat happens, it is a machine that stores it. The people most exposed often have the least control over time. An office worker may leave early. A tourist may step into a museum. A family with money may close the shutters and turn on air conditioning. But the warehouse worker cannot choose the hour when the delivery truck arrives. The nurse cannot pause a ward because the afternoon has become dangerous. The agricultural worker cannot move the harvest into the night without transport, pay, and legal protection. The person in a small rented room cannot make the building shed heat faster. The older resident living alone may not know that the danger has already crossed the threshold from discomfort into medical risk. This is where heat becomes a social event, not only a meteorological one. Official warnings try to translate invisible danger into public action. Meteorological agencies issue heat alerts. Health ministries advise people to drink water, avoid strenuous work, check on vulnerable neighbors, and keep indoor spaces cool. Cities may open cooling centers, extend pool hours, adjust waste collection, prepare emergency medical services, or send messages to residents. Hospitals may brace for more cases of dehydration, heat exhaustion, kidney stress, heart problems, respiratory strain, and complications in people whose bodies were already close to the edge. Public health agencies may remind employers that the day is not normal even if the sky is clear. But a warning is not the same thing as protection. A warning says danger is coming, a plan says what happens next. A warning can tell a person to stay cool, a plan can identify who has no cool room, a warning can tell people to drink water, a plan can make sure outdoor workers have breaks, shade, and changed hours. A warning can tell families to check on older relatives. A plan can organize calls, home visits, transport, and local registries before the emergency begins. A warning can say hospitals should prepare. A plan can define staffing, triage, cooling capacity, backup power, and communication channels. The difference is not bureaucratic, it is physical. It can be the difference between a message and a rescue. That is why the missing heat plans matter so much. They are not just documents sitting in government offices. When they work, they are choreography. They move information through a society before the heat turns into casualties. They tell a city when to open cooling spaces. They tell care homes when to change routines. They tell schools when outdoor activity becomes unsafe. They tell employers when work hours must shift. They tell health services when the first wave of calls is not a coincidence but a pattern. They tell neighbors that checking on someone is not kindness alone, but part of a public health response. Without that choreography, the burden falls downward. It falls onto the elderly person who must know when a room is too hot. It falls onto the migrant worker who must choose between safety and wages. It falls onto the nurse who has to manage more patients without more hands. It falls onto the family that may not understand the warning until the symptoms have already started. It falls onto local officials who must improvise under pressure. It falls onto emergency departments, where a climate signal becomes a human cue. The severity of the problem is not measured only by the highest temperature reported on a single day. It is measured by how many people are exposed, how long the exposure lasts, how hot the nights remain, how many buildings store heat, how many jobs require physical labor, how much spare capacity hospitals have, and how quickly a warning becomes action. In this kind of crisis, the headline number is only the doorway. The room behind it is filled with systems. Copernicus has reported that southeastern Europe recently saw a record number of tropical nights in summer, far above the average. A tropical night is not a poetic phrase. It means the temperature does not fall below a dangerous threshold during the night. For the human body, that matters because night is supposed to be the repair window. When the night stays hot, the body loses its recovery shift. The heart works harder, sleep becomes shallow, dehydration deepens. People with chronic illness start the next day already behind. A second hot day then lands on a body that has not returned to baseline. This is why the hospital scene is central. A heat wave does not enter a hospital as one single diagnosis. It enters as many. It enters as dizziness, confusion, fainting, falls, kidney trouble, heart strain, asthma, infection complications, medication problems, and people who simply cannot keep their core temperature under control. The patient may not say, "Climate change brought me here." The medical chart may not make that sentence visible. But the pattern is there. When heat persists, emergency calls rise. When nights stay warm, vulnerable bodies do not reset. When hospitals are already stretched, the heat does not need to create a new crisis from nothing. It only has to add pressure to an overloaded system. Care homes face the same problem in a quieter form. The residents may be older, less mobile, more dependent on medication, and less able to sense thirst or regulate body temperature. Staff may know exactly what danger looks like, but knowledge is not enough if the building overheats, if windows open onto hotter air, if cooling is limited, if staffing is thin, or if emergency transport is already strained. A care home in a heat wave is not just a building with vulnerable people inside. It is a test of whether society planned for people who cannot simply walk away from exposure. Outside, the labor system meets the heat differently. A construction site under extreme heat becomes a place where productivity and physiology collide. Muscles generate heat. Protective equipment traps heat. Asphalt, concrete, glass, and metal reflect and radiate heat. Breaks become medical prevention, not comfort. Shade becomes infrastructure, not luxury. Water becomes a workplace requirement, not a personal preference. When a worker slows down, that may be the body making a final intelligent decision before collapse. Yet in many jobs, slowing down has a cost. A person may lose wages, fall behind, or fear being replaced. Heat, therefore, turns inequality into a temperature reading. Farm work carries its own danger. Fields do not have walls, but they may also have no escape. The crop calendar does not always match the health warning. Harvest windows can be narrow. Animals need care. Irrigation has to be managed. Rural health services may be farther away. A heat plan that works for a city cannot simply be copied onto farmland. The same heat signal lands differently depending on the body, the job, the landscape, and the distance to help. Then there is transport, the system that reveals how much Europe depends on infrastructure built for past extremes. Rails can expand, roads can soften, overhead power lines and signaling systems can be stressed. Vehicles without adequate cooling become dangerous for passengers who are older, pregnant, ill, very young, or trapped in delays. A crowded platform during a heat alert is more than an inconvenience. It is a dense collection of bodies generating heat while waiting inside infrastructure that may not have been designed for this frequency of extremes. If trains slow down for safety, if roads buckle, if buses overheat, if power demand surges, the heat spreads from the weather forecast into the schedule of daily life. This is why the viewer should care, even if they do not live in southern Europe, even if their city still feels moderate, even if their home has cooling, even if they are young and healthy. Heat risk is networked. It travels through parents, grandparents, children, hospitals, food systems, labor, transport, insurance, energy demand, and public budgets. A person may not be medically vulnerable, but they may depend on a vulnerable system. They may rely on a train line that slows in heat, a hospital that is overcrowded, an elderly relative in a poorly cooled apartment, a school without shade, a power grid under peak load, or a job whose safety rules were written for yesterday's summers. In a connected society, heat does not have to harm everyone directly to disrupt everyone indirectly. The official language often sounds calm because public institutions have to be precise. They speak of heat health action plans, surveillance systems, early warnings, adaptation, preparedness, vulnerable groups, mortality, morbidity, and thermal stress. But behind those terms is something simple. Someone has to know who is in danger before the ambulance is called. Someone has to decide when a normal workday is no longer normal. Someone has to recognize that a warm night can be as dangerous as a hot afternoon. Someone has to turn climate data into doors opened, phone calls made, shifts changed, beds staffed, and bodies cooled. The European Environment Agency has warned that surveillance itself is uneven. Not every country monitors heat impacts on health in the same way. That matters because what is not counted can be underestimated. If a death certificate names a heart attack but not the heat that helped trigger it, the weather disappears from the official story. If hospital visits are not tracked quickly, the system may not see the wave until after it has broken. Data is not cold or distant here. Data is the nervous system of response. A country that cannot see heat illness clearly will struggle to act early. And still, the strangest part of the scene is how ordinary it can look. A heat emergency may begin with laundry drying too fast on a balcony, with a pharmacy running low on rehydration salts, with a school cancelling sports, with a train delay, with a daughter calling her father twice because he sounded confused the first time, with a doctor noticing more frail patients arriving in the same afternoon, with a city official realizing that the cooling center is open, but the people most at risk do not know how to get there, with a worker sitting down in the shade, not to rest, but because standing has become difficult. That is the first lesson of the present moment. Europe's heat crisis is not waiting for a cinematic disaster scene. It is already present in routines that were not designed to be emergency routines. It is in the apartment, the ward, the platform, the field, the care home, the schoolyard, the delivery route, and the city square. It is in the gap between a warning and a response. It is in the difference between knowing that heat is coming and having a system that knows what to do. The people at the center of this story are not abstract victims of climate change. They are residents of a continent that has entered a faster thermal era while still depending on slower institutions. Some will be protected by strong local planning, good housing, active public health systems, reliable data, and neighbors who are reached before the danger peaks. Others will meet the same weather with fewer defenses. That unevenness is the real field report. Because when Europe heats, it does not heat equally. It heats through walls, wages, age, illness, asphalt, isolation, and delay. It heats through the difference between a city with a plan and a city with advice. It heats through the difference between a warning that reaches a phone and a warning that changes a life. And once that is understood, the crisis no longer looks like a red patch on a weather map. It looks like a continent asking whether its systems can move as fast as the climate now does. The largest number in this story is not the temperature of a single afternoon. It is the rate of change. Copernicus and the World Meteorological Organization have stated that Europe has been warming about twice as fast as the global average since the 1980s, making it the fastest warming continent on Earth. That sentence can sound almost clean when placed inside a report. It has the neatness of a technical finding, twice as fast, fastest warming, continental scale. But inside that sentence is a physical change large enough to rewrite assumptions built into streets, homes, hospitals, labor schedules, insurance models, water systems, and emergency rooms. The danger is not that Europe has never experienced heat before. It has. Mediterranean summers have always been hot. Cities have always held warmth. Droughts, fires, and heat waves are not new to the continent's history. The danger is that the baseline is moving. The old range of heat, the one planners used to treat as a reference point, is no longer standing still. A hotter extreme now rises from a hotter starting line. A warm night begins from a warmer evening. A heat wave arrives in a society where the background temperature has already shifted upward. That is why the headline number matters. A continent warming twice as fast as the global average is not just experiencing bad weather more often, it is accumulating what can be called thermal debt. Thermal debt is the unpaid bill created when the climate changes faster than the built environment. Every old apartment without proper insulation carries part of it. Every care home designed for milder summers carries part of it. Every railway line calibrated around older heat thresholds carries part of it. Every city square paved in stone and asphalt, every hospital without enough cooling resilience, every schoolyard with little shade, every workplace safety rule that assumes extreme heat is rare, carries part of that debt. The debt does not appear all at once. It accumulates quietly. One summer, the night feels warmer than expected. Another summer, the city opens cooling spaces for longer. Another summer, a hospital sees more heat-related strain among older patients. Another summer, rail operators slow trains because tracks and equipment are stressed. Another summer, outdoor workers begin the day earlier, not because of preference, but because the afternoon has become a health risk. Each event may look temporary. Together, they are a ledger. This is the part that makes the number so heavy. Twice the global average does not mean every part of Europe warms equally. The Arctic edge, eastern regions, central zones, mountains, inland basins, coastlines, and dense cities all respond differently. But the continental signal is clear enough that it has become one of the defining climate facts of the region. Europe is not simply located in a warming world. Europe is one of the places where that warming is arriving, especially fast. To understand the scale, the number has to be pulled out of the abstract. A difference of 1 or 2 degrees Celsius may sound small because everyday weather swings by more than that between morning and afternoon. But climate is not weather in that sense. Climate is the floor beneath the weather. When the floor rises, the same weather pattern produces a more dangerous result. A high-pressure system that once produced a hot week can now produce a hotter week. A dry spell that once stressed crops can now pull moisture from soil faster. A night that once allowed bodies and buildings to cool can now remain warm enough to carry stress into the next day. The shift is like raising the stage under an actor. The actor may perform the same movement, but the height has changed, the fall is different, the risk is different. The audience may still see the same gesture, but the physics underneath it has been altered. That is what a warmer baseline does. It makes the old categories less reliable. A heat alert based on past experience may arrive too late for the new exposure. A building that was uncomfortable for a few days may become dangerous for a week. A city that once survived heat by waiting for a cooler night may find that the night no longer performs that function. A health system that treated heat illness as a seasonal spike may face a longer, more distributed burden. A labor rule written around exceptional conditions may have to confront a season in which those conditions are no longer exceptional. The headline number also matters because Europe's wealth can hide its vulnerability. A continent can have advanced medicine and still have overheated apartments. It can have modern rail networks and still have tracks stressed by extreme heat. It can have climate science, satellites, universities, and sophisticated forecasts, while still lacking local capacity to check on isolated people. It can have political institutions and still move slowly. It can have money and still have a housing stock built before extreme heat became a recurring design condition. The presence of development does not erase exposure. It only changes the form exposure takes. Heat tests the details. It tests whether a roof absorbs sunlight or reflects it. It tests whether windows can be shaded. It tests whether a tenant is allowed to install cooling. It tests whether an older person can afford electricity during a peak demand period. It tests whether a hospital's backup power can support cooling, not just lights and essential machines. It tests whether a train station has ventilation. It tests whether a city planted trees where people actually wait, walk, and work. It tests whether emergency messages reach people who do not speak the national language fluently. It tests whether a person has someone to call. This is why the same temperature can produce different outcomes across different neighborhoods. A tree-lined street and a dense paved street do not experience heat the same way. An apartment with cross-ventilation and an attic room under a dark roof do not experience heat the same way. A worker with protected breaks and a worker paid by output do not experience heat the same way. A city with an active heat health plan and a city relying mostly on general advice do not experience heat the same way. The climate signal may be continental, but the impact is local, uneven, and deeply personal. The number becomes even more unsettling when translated into the body. The human body does not care whether a temperature anomaly is written neatly in a climate report. It responds to heat through blood flow, sweating, breathing, thirst, fatigue, and stress on organs. When the surrounding environment becomes too hot for too long, the body must work harder to keep its core temperature within a narrow, safe range. This is not a matter of comfort, it is a matter of biological limits. The heart pumps more blood toward the skin. Sweat evaporates if the air allows it. Fluids and salts are lost. Medications can interfere with temperature regulation. Chronic illness can reduce resilience. Age can narrow the margin. A continent's warming rate, therefore, becomes a hospital fact. It becomes more people arriving dizzy, dehydrated, confused, or short of breath. It becomes a higher risk for those with cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, respiratory illness, diabetes, or limited mobility. It becomes more calls to emergency services during periods when staff and equipment are also under heat stress. It becomes more difficult decisions in care homes and home care systems. It becomes the question of whether public health has acted before the symptoms begin, or only after they fill waiting rooms. And still, the headline number can be misunderstood. Some may hear twice as fast and imagine that every summer must be twice as hot. That is not what the science means. It means the long-term temperature trend over Europe is rising at a faster rate than the global average. Weather will still vary. Some summers will be wetter, some regions will have storms, while others have drought. A cool week can still happen inside a warming climate, but the dice are being loaded toward more heat, stronger heat stress, and more frequent conditions that challenge old systems. The distinction matters because exaggeration weakens trust. The truth is already serious enough. Europe does not need a fictional future to face danger. The evidence is already present in observed warming, hotter years, increased heat stress, tropical nights, glacier loss, drought stress, wildfire risk, and public health concerns. The problem does not require saying that every warm day is a catastrophe. It requires recognizing that the statistical background has changed, and that society is still trying to operate with many assumptions from a cooler period. That is the meaning of thermal debt. A debt is created when a cost is delayed. For decades, buildings were constructed, cities expanded, transport systems were managed, and health systems were organized under a range of expected conditions. Those choices were not always foolish at the time. Many were reasonable for the climate people thought they lived in. But the climate has shifted. Now the bill arrives through retrofits, cooling needs, emergency planning, medical strain, productivity losses, crop stress, insurance costs, and preventable deaths. The longer adaptation is delayed, the larger the bill becomes. The most dangerous part of a thermal debt is that it can remain invisible until a crisis collects it. Before the heat wave, an apartment is just inefficient. During the heat wave, it becomes a trap. Before the heat wave, a lack of shade is an urban design flaw. During the heat wave, it becomes a health hazard. Before the heat wave, a missing registry of vulnerable residents is an administrative gap. During the heat wave, it becomes the reason someone is not contacted in time. Before the heat wave, a hospital cooling weakness is a facilities issue. During the heat wave, it becomes clinical risk. The headline number also changes the meaning of preparedness. Preparedness can no longer be treated as a seasonal reminder issued when the forecast turns red. If Europe is warming fastest, then adaptation has to become permanent infrastructure. Heat plans cannot be temporary pamphlets. They have to be operating systems. Housing policy becomes heat policy. Tree cover becomes health policy. Labor law becomes climate policy. Hospital design becomes adaptation policy. School scheduling becomes public safety policy. Electricity affordability becomes survival policy. The number pulls heat out of the weather segment and places it inside governance. That is why the missing plans from the previous scene are not a separate issue. They are the human side of the headline number. A faster warming continent needs faster translation from data to action. Copernicus can show the trend. The World Meteorological Organization can describe the climate signal. The European Environment Agency can map preparedness. Europe can warn that heat health action plans are essential tools. But after the reports are published, the decisive question moves to the ground. Does a local authority know which residents are most exposed? Does a doctor know when heat is driving a pattern of illness? Does an employer change shifts before bodies fail? Does a school protect children before the playground becomes unsafe? Does a city open cooling spaces where people can reach them? The number is continental. The response has to be intimate. This is where comparisons become useful. A warming rate is not easy to feel, but a warm bedroom after midnight is. A railway delay during a heat alert is. A street without shade is. A hospital corridor filled with vulnerable patients is. A power bill rising during a dangerous week is. A worker choosing between wages and health is. These are not separate from the headline number. They are how the headline number becomes ordinary life. There is also a deeper reason Europe's fast warming is so consequential. Europe is densely networked. People, goods, electricity, water, food, tourism, transport, and health systems cross borders constantly. Heat in one region can affect agriculture, river transport, power demand, hospital capacity, and labor movement in another. A continent that heats quickly does not only face isolated local emergencies, it faces synchronized stress, where multiple systems are pushed at the same time. A hot week can increase electricity demand while reducing worker productivity. It can stress crops while drying soils. It can disrupt rail schedules while increasing emergency medical calls. It can worsen air quality while making sleep harder. It can raise water demand while rivers run low. It can affect tourism, insurance, public budgets, and household income. The danger is not one domino. It is the possibility that many small pressures arrive together and reveal that the system had less spare capacity than it appeared to have. That is the true power of the headline number. It does not say merely that Europe is hotter. It says the margin is shrinking, the margin between comfort and illness, the margin between a functioning commute and a disrupted network, the margin between a hospital surge and a hospital crisis, the margin between a warm night and a dangerous night, the margin between advice and action, the margin between a plan that exists and a plan that reaches the person who needs it. A society can survive heat when it has margin. It can open windows when nights cool. It can move work when schedules are flexible. It can absorb patients when hospitals are not already stretched. It can ask neighbors to help when communities are connected. It can pay for cooling when energy is affordable. It can adapt infrastructure when budgets are strong and time is available. But fast warming consumes margin. It moves the starting line. It turns rare thresholds into repeated ones. It makes old design standards look optimistic. It turns heat from an event into a condition. And when a condition changes, response has to change as well. This is why Europe's headline number is not just a climate statistic. It is a warning label attached to the continent's assumptions. the assumption that temperate cities can tolerate heat without redesign, the assumption that hospitals can absorb seasonal pressure without deeper planning, the assumption that old housing can remain safe through new extremes, the assumption that advice is enough for people who have no cool place to go, the assumption that the next summer will resemble the last one closely enough for improvisation to work. The number says those assumptions are becoming expensive. And the most unsettling thing about thermal debt is that it is paid by bodies first. Before a government budget records the cost, before an insurance model adjusts, before a city approves a retrofit, before a parliament updates labour protections, the first payments come from people who sweat through the night, miss sleep, lose wages, strain their hearts, sit in emergency rooms, or endure heat alone behind closed doors. That is why the headline number should not be treated as background. It is the frame around everything else. Europe is warming quickly. Its protection is uneven. Its buildings are old in many places. Its populations are aging. Its cities store heat. Its health systems are already pressured. Its plans are incomplete. The sum of those facts is not panic. It is diagnosis. A diagnosis does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means the condition has been identified. It means the next question becomes practical, moral, and political at the same time. How much thermal debt will Europe continue to carry into each new summer? How many systems will be upgraded before the next dangerous week arrives? How many lives will depend not on the temperature itself, but on whether the warning becomes action? The thermometer gives the number. The continent decides what that number is allowed to do. The easiest way to misunderstand a European heat emergency is to stare at the highest number on the forecast. That number matters. A daily maximum can decide whether a school cancels outdoor activity, whether a rail operator slows trains, whether a city activates a heat alert, whether a hospital prepares for more calls. But the daily maximum is not the whole hazard. It is only the tallest point on a much larger shape. Beneath that peak is the duration of heat, the hours before it, the hours after it, and the night that may no longer bring relief. The overlooked danger is time. A single hot afternoon can be dangerous, especially for people working outside or living with illness. But a hot afternoon, followed by a warm evening, followed by a tropical night, followed by another hot afternoon, becomes something different. It becomes a continuous exposure event. The body is no longer facing one climb. It is being asked to climb without ever descending. Buildings are no longer absorbing heat and releasing it into a cool night. They are absorbing heat into an already warm night, then starting the next day with the previous day still inside the walls. This is the difference between heat as a spike and heat as a load. A spike is visible. It makes headlines. It gives a city a record. It gives newspapers a number large enough to print in bold. A load is quieter. It builds in tissues, in concrete, in hospital demand, in sleep loss, in kidney stress, in fatigue, in medication risk, in the small mistakes people make when their brains and bodies are working under thermal pressure. A spike shocks the system. A load occupies it. That is why the European State of the Climate reports from Copernicus and the World Meteorological Organization put so much attention on heat stress days and tropical nights, not only on maximum temperatures. Averaged across Europe, a recent year brought nearly a month of at least strong heat stress and around 12 tropical nights. In southeastern Europe, Copernicus reported a record 23 tropical nights in summer, compared with an average of 8 and a previous record of 16. The region also experienced its longest recorded July heat wave, lasting 13 consecutive days and affecting more than half the region. Those numbers change the story. A tropical night means the temperature does not fall below 20 degrees Celsius. In some climates, that may sound merely uncomfortable, but in a heat wave, especially in dense cities and poorly ventilated homes, the night is the body's repair interval. It is when the heart should work less hard, when the skin can release heat, when breathing slows, when sleep deepens, when dehydration can be corrected, when an older person begins the next day closer to normal. If the night remains too warm, that repair interval is shortened or removed. The next day begins with damage carried forward. The human body is not designed as a machine that can run indefinitely at high load. It depends on recovery. Muscles need it. The cardiovascular system needs it. The nervous system needs it. The kidneys need it. The brain needs it. Heat strips recovery away, not only by raising temperature, but by taking time. This is why duration can turn a manageable hazard into a medical emergency. The body may survive one hard day, It may not survive the third or fourth day if each night fails to cool it. The same principle applies to buildings. An old apartment block can behave like a thermal battery. During the day, walls, roofs, stairwells, asphalt courtyards, and surrounding streets absorb solar energy. In a normal pattern, cooler night air helps draw some of that stored heat away. But during a prolonged hot spell, the battery does not fully discharge. It begins the next morning partly charged. Then the sun adds more. By the end of several days, the indoor environment can become more dangerous than the outdoor number suggests, especially for people living under roofs, in upper floors, in small rooms, or in homes where windows open onto noisy or unsafe streets and cannot be kept open at night. This is why the question, "How hot did it get?" is too narrow. The better question is, how long did people remain unable to cool down? That question changes everything. It changes the meaning of a hot night. It changes the meaning of a closed school. It changes the meaning of a delayed train. It changes the meaning of a worker arriving home after an outdoor shift and sleeping in a room that has not cooled. It changes the meaning of a hospital admission several days into a heat wave when the emergency is not a sudden collapse out of nowhere, but the final visible point of a process that has been accumulating hour by hour. Duration also explains why heat deaths often appear delayed or hidden. A person does not always collapse at the hottest moment. An older resident may become weaker over several days. A heart condition may worsen after repeated stress. A person taking certain medications may become dehydrated more quickly. Someone sleeping poorly may become confused, fall, miss a dose, or fail to drink enough. The causal chain is not always spectacular. It is slow, intimate, and easy to miss. That slow chain is one reason heat can be underestimated. The public sees the peak. Hospitals see the accumulation. Families may see only that someone became strange, tired, faint, or breathless. Official statistics may see a cardiovascular death, a kidney injury, or a respiratory crisis. The heat may have acted as the pressure behind the event, but not always as the name on the event. Duration hides inside diagnoses. The atmosphere also adds another layer. Many dangerous European heat episodes are associated with persistent high-pressure patterns. High pressure can suppress cloud formation, reduce mixing, and allow sunlight to bake the land surface day after day. Air can sink, dry, and warm. Winds may weaken. Rain may stay away. Soil moisture can decline, and dry soils cool the air less through evaporation. When the land dries, more of the sun's energy goes into heating the surface rather than evaporating water. That feedback can make heat more intense and more persistent. This is not magic, it is a physical loop. Wet soil behaves partly like a cooling system because evaporation uses energy. Dry soil loses that cooling function. A city with many dark surfaces and little vegetation loses another cooling function. A stagnant air mass prevents relief from arriving. The heat then becomes both an atmospheric event and a surface event. It is above the city and inside the city. It is in the pressure pattern, the pavement, the building materials, and the human schedule. This is why not the daytime peak, but the duration is not a rhetorical trick. It is a scientific and public health distinction. A society organized around the highest forecast temperature may miss the cumulative risk. If alerts are triggered only by daytime maximums, they may fail to capture dangerous nights. If workplace rules respond only to afternoon peaks, they may ignore workers who start already heat-stressed from the previous day. If hospitals prepare for one surge day, they may underestimate a week of elevated demand. If cities open cooling centers only during narrow hours, they may miss the people trapped in hot apartments overnight. The hidden mechanism is the loss of reset. The body needs reset. Buildings need reset. Hospitals need reset. Electrical grids need reset. Transport networks need reset. Care workers need reset. Families need reset. When the night cools, systems get a chance to return toward baseline. When the night stays warm, the baseline itself moves upward. The next day begins not at zero, but at an elevated level of strain. After several days, the whole system is running on accumulated stress. This is the part of heat that can feel invisible until the failure appears. A hospital does not usually declare crisis because one outdoor thermometer reached a dramatic value. It feels the crisis when call volumes rise, when frail patients arrive in clusters, when staff are tired, when discharge becomes harder because homes are unsafe, when ambulances wait, when cooling equipment is strained, when power demand is high, and when the weather forecast says the next night will offer little relief. The heat has become administrative, medical, logistical, and human at the same time. A city experiences the same accumulation. Waste workers begin earlier. Public transport adjusts. Schools shorten outdoor time. Parks become crowded in shaded areas. Pharmacies answer more questions. Water demand changes. Emergency services monitor calls. Local officials look at maps of vulnerable neighborhoods and wonder whether advice is reaching people who need more than advice. In a short heat spike, improvisation may work. In a long heat load, improvisation starts to fray. For workers, duration turns exposure into depletion. An outdoor worker can sometimes survive one brutal afternoon with breaks, water, shade, and luck. But if the job continues day after day, if the commute is hot, if the home is hot, if sleep is poor, if wages depend on output, and if the next morning starts before the body has recovered, the danger compounds. The workplace exposure is only one part of the thermal day. Heat follows the worker home. Then the home sends the worker back, not fully repaired. For older people, duration narrows the margin more quietly. Age can reduce the ability to sweat efficiently. Chronic illness can reduce cardiovascular reserve. Some medications can affect hydration, salt balance, blood pressure, or sweating. Social isolation can delay help. A person may not feel thirsty enough. They may not recognize confusion as a danger sign. They may keep windows closed for safety or noise. They may avoid using cooling because electricity costs money. In that setting, the second or third hot night can be more dangerous than the first hot afternoon. For cities, duration reveals design flaws. Trees matter most where people linger, not just where planners can count canopy cover. Shade matters on walking routes to pharmacies, clinics, bus stops, schools, and cooling centers. Public fountains matter when people can reach them. Cool roofs matter when upper floors become heat traps. Building codes matter when old housing becomes the front line of climate adaptation. A city that measures only air temperature may miss the lived heat on a treeless street where pavement and walls radiate warmth from every direction. Duration also exposes the difference between warning and action. A forecast can say that heat will last, but if the plan does not specify what changes after the second night, the third day, or the fourth day, then the warning remains too thin. A real heat plan has to understand escalation. It has to recognize that risk is not constant. It rises as exposure accumulates. The same temperature on the first day and the fourth day does not mean the same danger. This is one of the most important ideas in the entire story. Heat is cumulative, vulnerability is cumulative, system strain is cumulative. A person who slept badly is not the same person the next day. A hospital that handled extra patients for several days is not the same hospital later in the event. A building that failed to cool for several nights is not the same building the next morning. A power grid under repeated peak demand is not the same grid at the beginning of the event. Time changes the hazard. That means Europe's heat risk cannot be understood as a collection of hot afternoons. It has to be understood as a sequence of warm nights, a sequence of overloaded shifts, a sequence of closed windows, a sequence of delayed recovery, a sequence of public messages that either reach people and trigger action or simply pass over them while the heat keeps working. The image is not a hammer blow, it is a vice. A hammer blow is sudden, everyone hears it. A vice tightens gradually. At first, there is pressure, then discomfort, then pain, then damage. Heat often behaves like that vice. It tightens around bodies, buildings, and institutions hour by hour. By the time the damage becomes visible, the important part of the event has already been happening for days. That is the overlooked danger. Not simply the number at the top of the thermometer, not simply the red color on a weather map, not simply the afternoon when the street becomes unbearable. The danger is the time the heat is allowed to stay. The danger is the missing night. The danger is the failure to reset. The danger is the assumption that if the peak is survived, the event is over. In Europe's new thermal reality, the event may not be over when the sun goes down. It may be entering its most dangerous phase. To understand why a heat plan can become life-saving, the story has to move from the weather map into the body. Heat does not kill because air is uncomfortable. It kills when the body's cooling system is pushed beyond its operating range. That system is quiet, automatic, and usually so successful that most people rarely think about it. Every hour of every day, the human body tries to keep its core temperature within a narrow zone. Too cold, and organs slow. Too hot, and proteins, cells, blood chemistry, and nerve signals begin to fail. Human survival depends on a stable internal climate, even while the outside climate changes. The central mechanism is heat stress. Heat stress is what happens when the body has to work harder than normal to release heat into the environment. It is not only a measure of air temperature, it is the combined pressure of temperature, humidity, sunlight, wind, physical activity, clothing, age, health, medication, housing, and duration. Person standing still in the shade faces one kind of heat stress. A roofer carrying materials in direct sun faces another. An older woman in a sealed apartment after 3 hot nights faces another. The thermometer may show the same number, but the body does not experience the same danger. The body has 2 main ways to defend itself. First, it moves blood toward the skin. The heart pumps harder, blood vessels near the surface widen, and heat is carried outward so it can leave the body. This is why skin can feel flushed during heat. The body is sending warm blood toward the edge, trying to turn the skin into a radiator. Second, the body sweats. Sweat by itself is not the cooling mechanism, evaporation is. When sweat evaporates from the skin, it takes heat with it. This is one of the most elegant survival systems in human biology. A thin layer of moisture becomes a cooling surface. The body turns water into protection. But every protection has limits. If the air is too humid, sweat does not evaporate efficiently. It sits on the skin, making the person feel drenched but not properly cooled. If the air is too still, evaporation slows. If a person is working hard, muscles produce more internal heat at the same time the environment is adding external heat. If clothing or protective gear traps warmth, the body loses another pathway. If a person is dehydrated, sweating becomes harder. If the heart is weak, moving enough blood to the skin becomes dangerous. If the person is older, very young, pregnant, chronically ill, or taking certain medications, the margin narrows. This is where heat becomes not just weather, but physiology. The term wet bulb temperature helps explain the extreme edge of this danger. A wet bulb temperature is measured by wrapping a thermometer in a wet cloth and letting evaporation cool it. The reading shows how well evaporation can work under the combined conditions of heat and humidity. When humidity is high, evaporation slows, and the wet bulb temperature rises. In simple terms, it asks a brutal question: can sweat still cool the body? Or has the air become too loaded with moisture to accept more evaporation? This does not mean every dangerous heat wave requires the most extreme wet bulb values. Many people can die at lower thresholds, especially if they are older, sick, isolated, working outside, or trapped in hot housing. But the concept reveals the physics behind the fear. Heat danger is not only about hot air touching the skin, it is about whether the body can dump heat into the world around it. When the surrounding world stops accepting that heat, the body becomes trapped inside its own metabolism. The World Health Organization's European office has repeatedly warned that heat harms health through multiple pathways and that many heat deaths are preventable with action plans. That word, preventable, is important. It means the mechanism is known. The danger is not mysterious. The body overheats in recognizable ways. Public health has tools to reduce exposure, identify vulnerable people, change behavior, and create cooler environments. The tragedy is not that heat is impossible to understand. The tragedy is that understanding does not automatically become protection. At the beginning of heat stress, the signs can look ordinary. A person becomes thirsty, then tired, then slightly dizzy, concentration drops, work slows, a headache appears, a child becomes irritable, an older person becomes unusually quiet, a worker makes small mistakes. Sleep becomes fragmented. The body is already spending extra energy to stay within its safe internal range. As exposure continues, the symptoms deepen. Sweating may become heavy, muscles may cramp as water, and salts are lost. The heart may beat faster, blood pressure may become unstable, nausea can appear, weakness can make walking difficult, confusion can begin. In heat exhaustion, the body is struggling but still fighting. It is sending warnings. Heat stroke is different. Heat stroke is a medical emergency. It occurs when the body can no longer control core temperature effectively, and the internal temperature rises to a dangerous level. The brain is vulnerable. Organs are vulnerable. The person may become confused, collapse, seize, or lose consciousness. Sweating may continue or may fail. Waiting is dangerous. Cooling has to begin fast, because heat stroke is not discomfort. It is system failure. This is the point where the climate outside becomes organ failure inside. The heart is often at the center of that failure. During heat, the heart has to pump more blood toward the skin while still supplying the brain, muscles, kidneys, and other organs. For a healthy young adult at rest, this extra demand may be manageable. For someone with cardiovascular disease, heart failure, high blood pressure, or limited reserve, the demand can become too much. A heat wave can therefore appear in medical records as heart strain, heart attacks, strokes, or sudden deterioration in people who were already fragile. The kidneys are also exposed. They depend on adequate blood flow and fluid balance. During heat, the body loses water through sweat. If a person does not replace enough fluid, blood volume can fall and kidneys can become stressed. Repeated dehydration can contribute to acute kidney injury. Outdoor workers are especially vulnerable because they may combine heavy labor, long exposure, sweating, and limited access to rest or water. In a warming Europe, kidney stress is not only a tropical concern. It is a labor concern, a hospital concern, and a climate adaptation concern. The lungs can suffer as well. Heat can worsen air pollution, especially when sunlight and stagnant air help form ground-level ozone. Smoke from wildfires can add another burden. People with asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or other respiratory conditions may find that hot air, poor air quality, and dehydration make breathing harder. The weather event then becomes a chain event. Heat strains the body directly, worsens air quality, affects sleep, increases stress, and can push existing disease into crisis. The brain is not spared. Heat affects cognition, mood, reaction time, and decision-making. This matters for drivers, machine operators, construction workers, nurses, caregivers, elderly residents, and anyone making safety decisions under pressure. A hot body is not just a tired body. It can be a less precise body, a slower body, a more error-prone body. On a normal day, a small mistake may remain small. During a heat wave, mistakes can cascade into falls, accidents, missed medications, delayed calls for help, and workplace injuries. Children face a different risk because their bodies are still developing and their behavior depends on adults. They may not recognize danger early. They may keep playing. They may not drink enough. Infants rely entirely on caregivers to manage shade, hydration, clothing, and indoor temperatures. Schools and childcare centers therefore become part of the heat protection system. A classroom that overheats is not only uncomfortable, it is a public health environment. Pregnant people face elevated concern because heat can strain cardiovascular function, hydration, and thermoregulation. Severe heat exposure has been associated in scientific literature with risks for pregnancy outcomes, though exact risk varies by population and context. This is why careful public health messaging matters. The goal is not to create panic, it is to make visible the groups whose bodies are doing more work under the same weather. Medication adds another hidden layer. Some medicines can affect sweating, thirst, kidney function, blood pressure, salt balance, or the body's ability to respond to heat. Diuretics can increase fluid loss. Certain psychiatric medications can interfere with temperature regulation. Some heart and blood pressure medicines can change how the cardiovascular system responds. This does not mean people should stop medication on their own during heat. It means health systems need clear guidance, clinicians need awareness, and vulnerable patients need support before the hottest days arrive. That is why heat health action plans are not merely public announcements, they are mechanisms for protecting biological limits. A strong plan can trigger early warnings before hospitals fill. It can identify high-risk groups. It can coordinate messages between weather services, health agencies, local authorities, care homes, employers, schools, and hospitals. It can define when outdoor labor should change hours. It can prepare emergency services for specific patterns of illness. It can open cooling spaces before the peak. It can guide clinicians on medication risks. It can direct outreach toward people who live alone. It can make the invisible mechanism visible enough to interrupt. The simplest example is the check-in call. On paper, it looks small. A local worker, volunteer, neighbor, or care service contacts an older person during a heat alert. But medically, that call can function like an early warning sensor. Is the person drinking? Is the room hot? Is the person confused? Are windows shaded? Is there a fan? Is there access to a cooler place? Does someone need transport? A society cannot lower the outdoor temperature with a phone call, but it can lower exposure. It can shorten the time a vulnerable body spends trapped in unsafe heat. Cooling centers follow the same logic. They are not symbols, they are exposure reduction devices. A few hours in a cooler environment can give the body time to reduce accumulated strain, but they only work if people know where they are, can reach them, feel safe using them, and can remain there long enough to matter. A cooling center placed too far from vulnerable neighborhoods, open at the wrong hours, or poorly communicated may exist officially while failing physically. Shade is also medical infrastructure. A tree along a walking route can reduce radiant heat on the body. A shaded bus stop can lower exposure for an older person waiting for transport. A cool roof can reduce indoor heat. Reflective surfaces can lower stored heat. Ventilation can help buildings release warmth. Urban design, in this context, becomes preventive medicine. It is easy to think of medicine as something that happens inside clinics. During heat, medicine can happen through a street tree, a water fountain, a building code, or a labor regulation. Air conditioning is part of the story, but it is not the entire solution. Cooling can save lives, especially for high-risk people. But dependence on mechanical cooling raises other questions. Electricity cost, grid stress, emissions if power is fossil-based, access inequality, and safety during outages. A wealthy household may treat air conditioning as comfort. A poor household may treat it as an unaffordable medicine. A hospital may need it for survival, but must also have backup power. Europe's challenge is not simply to install machines. It is to design layered cooling, buildings that resist heat, cities that provide shade, public spaces that offer refuge, health systems that act early, and energy systems that can support cooling without creating new risks. This layered approach matters because heat stress is layered. The weather provides one layer, the city adds another, the building adds another, the person's age and health add another, the job adds another, social isolation adds another, poverty adds another. A heat health plan has to cut through multiple layers at once. Telling people to drink water is useful, but insufficient if they live in a room that stays hot all night. Telling people to avoid outdoor activity is useful, but insufficient if their wages depend on physical labor. Telling people to seek cool spaces is useful, but insufficient if transport is disrupted or the nearest center is far away. This is the central truth of the mechanism. Heat becomes deadly when the body cannot release enough heat, and society fails to reduce the exposure in time. The two failures interact. A body under stress needs the environment to become less hostile. A society under stress needs plans that act before biology reaches its limit. When those plans are missing or uneven, the burden shifts onto individuals at the exact moment when individuals may have the least capacity to respond. The metaphor of the city as a machine helps make this clear. During a heat wave, the city absorbs energy all day. Roofs, asphalt, walls, vehicles, industrial equipment, and air conditioners all add to the thermal environment. Dense neighborhoods with little vegetation become hotter than surrounding areas. Night arrives, but the machine keeps radiating. Inside that machine are smaller machines: hospitals, trains, elevators, refrigeration systems, water pumps, electrical transformers, and inside all of them are human bodies, each trying to maintain a core temperature near normal. The smallest cooling system is the human body. It has no spare parts. It cannot defer maintenance until autumn. It cannot negotiate with the atmosphere. It can sweat, pump blood, slow down, seek shade, drink, rest, and signal distress. But if the surroundings remain too hot for too long, and if the social systems around it fail to intervene, the body begins to lose the argument. That is what heat stress means. It is the argument between a warming environment and a biological system with limits. And in Europe's fast-warming climate, that argument is becoming more frequent, more prolonged, and more consequential. The question is not whether the science can name the mechanism. It can. The question is whether public systems can act on the mechanism before it appears as a death certificate, an ambulance call, a hospital surge, a collapsed worker, or an older person found too late in a room that never cooled. Europe has been warned before. The warning did not arrive first as a graph, a treaty, or a climate projection. It arrived as a summer that overwhelmed assumptions. In 2003, a massive heat wave struck Europe and became one of the deadliest climate-related disasters in the continent's modern history. Later analysis estimated more than 70,000 excess deaths across Europe that summer. In France alone, roughly 14,800 excess deaths were recorded during the worst period. The numbers are so large that they can almost become numb, but each one represented a body that could not release heat fast enough, a home that did not cool, a family that did not realize the danger in time, a health system that was forced to understand heat not as discomfort, but as mass casualty risk. That summer is important because it broke an illusion. Before 2003, heat was often treated as an inconvenience in many parts of Europe, something difficult, unpleasant, even dangerous for some, but not always understood as a systemic public health emergency. The disaster changed that. It showed that a wealthy continent, with hospitals, governments, weather services, and modern infrastructure, could still lose tens of thousands of people when heat arrived in the wrong pattern, with the wrong duration, over populations and buildings that were not prepared. The victims were not mostly people standing in dramatic outdoor scenes. Many died indoors, many were older, many were isolated, many lived in homes that became unsafe, many had medical conditions that heat worsened, many were not reached soon enough. The disaster was not only a failure of temperature, it was a failure of connection. That is the lesson Europe was handed. Heat does not only ask whether a country has hospitals, it asks whether those hospitals are warned early enough. It does not only ask whether a country has weather forecasts, it asks whether those forecasts trigger action in neighborhoods, care homes, workplaces, and homes where people live alone. It does not only ask whether a government can issue advice, it asks whether that advice becomes transport, phone calls, cooling rooms, staffing, change schedules, and protection for people whose bodies have less margin. After 2003, the phrase Heat Health Action Plan began to carry more weight. It no longer sounded like a technical add-on, it sounded like a missing survival system. Several countries and cities began to improve warnings, identify vulnerable groups, coordinate between meteorological and health agencies, and prepare emergency responses before the peak of heat. France, shocked by the scale of loss, became one of the places where public health planning changed. The United Kingdom developed heat health warning systems. Other countries started building their own versions of heat response. The lesson seemed clear. But history does not protect anyone by itself. A lesson only matters if it is maintained, updated, funded, practiced, and expanded as the hazard changes. A plan written after one disaster can become outdated if heat grows more frequent, populations age, cities expand, housing remains inefficient, and hospitals face new pressures. The question after 2003 was not whether Europe had been warned. It had. The question was whether the warning would be converted into a continent-wide operating system. 2 decades later, the answer is still uneven. The European Environment Agency has reported that only 21 of the 38 EEA countries have heat health action plans in place, while 4 more are developing them. That does not mean countries without fully operational plans are doing nothing. Some may have warnings, local programs, emergency guidance, or climate adaptation measures, but it does mean that Europe's protective architecture remains incomplete. The memory of disaster exists, the science exists, the public health logic exists, yet the map of implementation still has gaps. That is why the past matters so much in this story. It prevents the present from being dismissed as surprise. Europe cannot say it did not know heat could kill at scale. It cannot say it had no example of vulnerable people dying indoors. It cannot say the link between heat, health, isolation, and planning was invisible. 2003 exposed the pattern with brutal clarity. The continent saw what happens when a heat wave collides with social isolation, inadequate warning, weak outreach, and unprepared institutions. And then came newer summers. In 2022, Europe experienced another severe summer of heat. A study published in Nature Medicine estimated 61,672 heat-related deaths across Europe between late May and early September. That figure was lower than the estimated excess death toll of 2003, but it was still enormous. It showed that adaptation had not erased the risk. It showed that modern warnings and improved awareness may reduce some losses, but they do not make the continent safe by default. It showed that a warming baseline can keep returning the same exam with harder questions. The comparison between 2003 and 2022 is not simple, and it should not be made carelessly. Europe changed during those years. Populations aged, health systems changed, cities changed, data improved. Heat action plans appeared in some places, public awareness increased, air conditioning use expanded in some regions. Mortality estimates use different methods and time windows. Not every number is directly comparable, as if it were measured with the same ruler. But the broad lesson is still clear. Major heat mortality did not belong only to the past. It returned in a Europe that already knew heat was dangerous. That is the disturbing part. A disaster can be shocking the first time because society has not yet learned the mechanism. But when a similar pattern returns after the mechanism is known, the question changes. It is no longer only what happened. It becomes, why were so many people still exposed? It becomes, which protections worked and which failed? It becomes, which countries learned, which cities adapted, which communities remained invisible, and which plans existed on paper but did not fully reach the body in danger. The history of European heat is therefore not a line of isolated summers. It is a record of warnings. 2003 warned that heat can kill tens of thousands in a developed region. Later studies warned that mortality concentrates among older and vulnerable populations. Public health agencies warned that many heat deaths can be prevented through planning. Copernicus and the World Meteorological Organization warned that Europe is warming faster than the global average. The European Environment Agency warned that national preparedness remains incomplete. Together, these warnings form a chain. The chain matters because each link reduces uncertainty. There is no need to invent a dramatic theory. The evidence already exists. Heat waves can raise mortality. Heat stress harms the body through known mechanisms. Older people and people with chronic illness face higher risk. Social isolation can turn indoor heat into a deadly trap. Warm nights remove recovery. Cities can amplify heat. Public health plans can reduce exposure. Missing plans can leave action too late. This is not speculation. It is the accumulated record of European summers. One of the most important studies in this record is not valuable only because of its death estimate. It is valuable because of what it reveals about scale. The Nature Medicine study on 2022 did not describe a handful of tragic anomalies. It analyzed mortality across hundreds of regions and dozens of countries. That kind of research turns a hidden disaster into a visible pattern. It shows that heat-related mortality is not only a story of one city, one hospital, or one headline wave. It is a continental signal appearing through local deaths. But even that research has a limitation that reinforces the larger argument. Heat mortality is often estimated after the fact. The deaths are counted when the heat has passed, when the funerals are over, when the summer is already entering statistical memory. That delay is part of the danger. A flood can be counted by buildings underwater. A storm can be counted by power lines down. Heat often requires epidemiology to reveal its full cost. The disaster may be largest in the data weeks or months later, but prevention must happen before and during the event. That is why surveillance matters. A country that can rapidly detect heat-related illness, emergency calls, hospital admissions, mortality patterns, and vulnerable groups has a better chance of acting while the event is still unfolding. A country that only sees the toll after the season ends learns too late for the people already lost. The European Environment Agency has pointed out that heat health surveillance is not uniform across all EEA countries. That unevenness means some parts of the continent may understand the impact faster than others. In a fast-warming region, delayed vision can become delayed protection. The past also shows that the danger is not confined to southern Europe, even though southern Europe often carries intense exposure. France in 2003 became a symbol of heat disaster. Italy and Spain have repeatedly appeared in heat mortality studies. Greece, Portugal, and other Mediterranean countries face severe heat, drought, and wildfire risks. But Northern and Central Europe are not outside the story. They may have populations, housing, and public expectations built around cooler summers. That can create a different kind of vulnerability. lower acclimatization, less cooling infrastructure, and a public less accustomed to treating heat as lethal. In other words, the map of danger is not simply the map of hottest places. It is the map of mismatch. Heat becomes most dangerous where the weather exceeds what bodies, buildings, and institutions are prepared to handle. A northern city can be vulnerable because it did not expect long, hot nights. A southern city can be vulnerable because the heat is more intense and more frequent. A wealthy district can be safer because of trees, cooling, and healthcare access. A poorer district can become dangerous because of dense housing, outdoor work, and lack of refuge. The same European heat history writes different chapters in different places. This is why the 2003 disaster remains so relevant. It showed that death can concentrate in the spaces society overlooks, behind apartment doors, inside care homes, among people whose routines are not visible to emergency systems. It showed that heat does not have to destroy infrastructure to expose its weaknesses. It showed that public health is not only a hospital function, it is a relationship between weather forecasts, housing, labor, social care, local government, families, and time. The repeated disasters since then add another lesson. Adaptation works, but only when it is real. A warning system can save lives if it reaches the right people early enough. A heat plan can reduce mortality if it changes behavior, staffing, outreach, and exposure. Better awareness can help families check on older relatives. Urban cooling can reduce stress. Medical guidance can protect high-risk patients. Workplace rules can prevent collapse. None of these measures requires waiting for a new scientific breakthrough. The tools exist, but tools that are not deployed do not protect. A heat plan that is not funded is not a plan in the body's experience. A warning that people cannot understand or act upon is not protection. A cooling center that is inaccessible is not refuge. A labor recommendation without enforcement may not save the worker paid by the hour. A city tree planted far from the hottest walking routes does not shade the person waiting for a bus. A surveillance system that reports too slowly cannot guide urgent response. The past teaches not only what to do, but how easy it is to confuse intention with protection. This is the comparison with the present moment. Europe now has better climate science than it had in 2003. It has satellite monitoring, high-resolution forecasts, health research, mortality studies, and decades of public health experience. It also has a hotter baseline, more frequent heat stress, aging populations, pressured hospitals, urban heat islands, and incomplete planning. The continent is therefore more informed and more exposed at the same time. That is the contradiction at the heart of the story. The present is not a repeat of 2003. It is more complicated. The heat hazard has evolved, the climate baseline has moved, the public health language has matured, the data is better, some countries are better prepared. Yet the central vulnerability remains recognizable. When heat lasts, and when people cannot cool down, the first failures occur in the places least visible from a weather map. The old lesson still applies because the human body has not changed. It still needs recovery. It still needs water, shade, cooler air, medical stability, and time. A past disaster becomes useful only if it sharpens the present. 2003 should not be remembered only as a tragedy. It should be remembered as a diagnostic event. It revealed the anatomy of heat mortality, isolation, age, illness, hot housing, insufficient outreach, delayed recognition, weak coordination, and the deadly assumption that heat is less serious than storms or floods because it leaves fewer images behind. 2022 then showed that the anatomy still exists. The names, places, and numbers change. The mechanism returns. That is why the history of European heat is not behind Europe. It is under Europe. It sits beneath every new forecast, every tropical night, every heat alert, every hospital surge, every debate over cooling, every city plan, every worker protection rule, and every missing heat health action plan. The continent has already been shown what heat can do. The warning has already been paid for. The question is whether the next chapter will be written as preparation or as another retrospective study counting people who might have been reached sooner. The people most at risk in a European heatwave are not always standing under the hottest sun. Some are inside. They are behind apartment doors, under roofs that have stored heat for days. in rooms where the air moves only when a window can be opened, and where opening the window may mean noise, pollution, insects, security worries, or simply hotter air coming in from the street. They are in care homes where staff understand the danger but cannot redesign the building during an emergency. They are in hospitals where cooling is not a luxury but part of patient safety. They are in social housing, temporary housing, attic rooms, rented flats, informal settlements, and neighborhoods where the city has more concrete than shade. This is the layer of the story that the headline number cannot show. A map can show heat. It cannot show whether a person has a cool room. It cannot show whether an older resident lives alone. It cannot show whether a worker can refuse an unsafe shift. It cannot show whether a family can afford electricity. It cannot show whether a bus stop has shade, whether a clinic is reachable, whether a care worker has enough time, whether a tenant can make changes to a home, or whether a city knows which doors to knock on before the ambulance is needed. Heat risk hides inside the shape of daily life. The first vulnerable layer is housing. Across Europe, many buildings were designed for a climate in which keeping warmth inside was often the central problem. Thick walls, dense roofs, small ventilation gaps, upper-floor apartments, and insulated interiors can all behave differently when summers become hotter and nights stay warm. A home that saves energy in winter can become dangerous in summer if it traps heat and lacks safe ventilation. The same building that protected people from cold may fail to protect them from accumulated heat. That does not mean every old building is unsafe or every modern building is safe. Architecture is more complicated than that. Some older buildings have shutters, courtyards, high ceilings, thick walls, and ventilation patterns that can reduce heat if maintained and used well. Some newer buildings have large glass surfaces, poor shading, and overheating problems. The issue is not age alone. The issue is whether the building can prevent dangerous indoor heat, release stored heat at night, and offer residents a realistic way to cool down. For many people, that choice does not exist. A tenant may not be allowed to install shading, external blinds, or cooling equipment. A low-income household may avoid using cooling because electricity bills are already difficult. An older person may keep windows closed because of fear of theft. A person living near traffic may choose between heat and noise. A family in a crowded apartment may have too many bodies generating heat in too little space. A person in temporary housing may have no control over insulation, airflow, or appliances. During a heat wave, housing policy becomes health policy without changing its name. Then there is the city itself. Urban heat does not fall evenly. It concentrates where surfaces absorb and radiate energy. Asphalt, dark roofs, stone, brick, concrete, traffic, industrial surfaces, and dense blocks can turn neighborhoods into heat reservoirs. Vegetation, shade, water, reflective materials, and open airflow can reduce exposure. The difference between two streets can be the difference between a walkable route and a dangerous route for an older person going to a pharmacy. A city may count total tree canopy and still fail the person waiting at a bus stop with no shade. It may have parks and still leave the hottest neighborhoods exposed. It may open cooling centers and still place them beyond the reach of people without transport. It may issue advice to avoid the hottest hours and still require low-wage workers to commute, deliver, clean, build, and care during those hours. Heat reveals whether urban planning serves the body at street level. The next vulnerable layer is work. Outdoor labor is one of the clearest examples because the exposure is visible. Construction workers, agricultural workers, road crews, delivery riders, port workers, waste collectors, security staff, tourism workers, and event staff all meet heat directly. But visibility does not guarantee protection. A hard hat can protect the head from impact while trapping heat. High visibility clothing can protect against accidents while adding thermal burden. Gloves, boots, masks, uniforms, and protective gear can be necessary for safety and still increase heat stress. Work creates a conflict that public health advice alone cannot solve. Advice can say to avoid strenuous activity during the hottest hours, but a worker may not control the schedule. Advice can say to rest in the shade, but shade may not exist on the site. Advice can say to drink water, but water may be far away, breaks may be informal, and a worker paid by output may lose income by slowing down. Advice can say to recognize early symptoms, but a worker may hide weakness to avoid being judged unreliable. Heat then becomes a labor rights issue, not only a weather issue. Migrant workers often stand at a dangerous intersection. They may do physically demanding work, they may have less secure contracts, they may fear losing wages or legal stability. They may receive warnings in a language they do not fully understand. They may live in crowded or poor quality housing after the shift ends. They may have limited access to healthcare. A heatwave does not treat those details as background. It uses them. It enters through every weak point at once. The same is true for informal workers and gig workers. A delivery rider may be technically free to stop, yet economically pressured to continue. A platform may not feel the heat, the rider does. The app can keep assigning routes while the street becomes medically unsafe. A tourism worker may face crowds, uniforms, long hours, and the pressure to keep the economy moving. A cleaner may work in overheated interiors. A kitchen worker may face indoor heat from equipment at the same time outdoor temperatures rise. Heat does not respect the boundary between indoor and outdoor work. Care work is another hidden front line. Care workers protect people whose bodies have less margin, but they may be under pressure themselves. They move between homes, travel through hot streets, enter apartments that may already be unsafe, help people wash, dress, eat, hydrate, and take medicine, all while carrying the physical and emotional load of the heat. In a care home, staff may monitor fluids, move residents away from sun-exposed rooms, change routines, watch for confusion, and manage medications. But staffing levels, building design, cooling access, and emergency protocols decide whether knowledge becomes protection. Older people remain one of the most important vulnerable groups, not because age alone defines weakness, but because heat interacts with physiology and isolation. Aging can reduce the ability to sense thirst, sweat efficiently, and respond to thermal stress. Chronic illness can lower reserve. Medications can affect hydration, blood pressure, kidney function, or temperature regulation. Limited mobility can prevent a person from reaching a cooler place. Social isolation can delay help. The most dangerous heat wave may not be the one an older person sees through a window. It may be the one that slowly transforms their room while nobody realizes they have stopped coping. Children face another pattern of vulnerability. They depend on adults to manage exposure. They may not understand why play has become dangerous. They may not drink enough. Infants cannot move themselves into shade or describe symptoms clearly. Schools, childcare centers, playgrounds, and transport systems become part of the heat protection system. If a school building overheats, the problem is not only education, it is health, learning, safety, and family logistics at the same time. People with chronic diseases carry additional risk. Heart disease, kidney disease, respiratory illness, diabetes, mental health conditions, neurological disorders, and limited mobility can all change how heat affects the body. The danger is often not a dramatic heat stroke appearing out of nowhere. It can be the worsening of an existing condition. It can be breathlessness, dehydration, dizziness, confusion, medication complications, falls, and a body pushed beyond its normal compensation. People experiencing homelessness are exposed in a different and often brutal way. They may have no private cool space, no reliable access to water, no safe sleep, no protection from sun during the day or stored heat at night, and limited ability to follow official advice. A public message that says to stay indoors assumes there is an indoors. A message that says to seek a cool place assumes a person is welcome there. Heat exposes the moral content hidden inside ordinary instructions. The electricity system adds another layer. Cooling saves lives, but only where it is accessible, affordable, and reliable. During extreme heat, power demand can rise. If households fear bills, they may underuse cooling even when medically vulnerable. If the grid is stressed, outages can become dangerous. If hospitals, care homes, and shelters lack resilient backup systems, a cooling strategy can fail exactly when it is most needed. Energy poverty turns heat into a private emergency inside the home. Hospitals are vulnerable not because they lack medical knowledge, but because they are systems with limits. A hospital during a heat wave has to cool patients, protect staff, manage more emergency visits, maintain equipment, preserve medicines, keep operating rooms safe, and prepare for power stress. It must also discharge people into homes that may not be safe. That is one of the hardest parts. A patient can be medically stable in a cooled ward and still be at risk if sent back to an overheated apartment. The hospital door is not the edge of the heat system. Transportation can make protection reachable or impossible. A cooling center that requires a long walk across a hot neighborhood may not serve the people most at risk. A bus delay can become a health exposure. A train platform without shade can become a heat chamber. An elevator outage in a tall building can trap an older resident upstairs. When heat affects transport, it affects healthcare access, work, food shopping, social contact, and emergency response. This is why the danger is greater than the headline number. The headline number says how hot the air became. Vulnerability asks who had to live inside that air, who could escape it, who could pay to reduce it, who had help, who had information, who had legal protection, who had transportation, and who was already medically close to the edge. Heat is physical, but exposure is political. It is shaped by housing markets, labor rules, urban design, public health budgets, social care, energy prices, and the distribution of shade. The European Environment Agency's work on heat health preparedness matters because it makes this unevenness visible. A country can have a warning system, but weak surveillance. Another can have surveillance, but limited outreach. A city can have climate adaptation language, but few practical triggers. A national plan can exist while local implementation remains uneven. The phrase, Heat Health Action Plan, sounds administrative, but in practice, it asks whether the vulnerable layers have been mapped before the heat arrives. The most dangerous assumption is that vulnerability is obvious. It is not. A person can look safe because they live in a rich country and still be trapped in a hot room. A city can look green from above and still have deadly microclimates at street level. A hospital can look modern and still struggle with cooling resilience. A worker can look healthy and still collapse after repeated exposure. A warning can look successful because it was sent, while the people most at risk never acted on it, never received it, or had no way to follow it. Vulnerability is often the distance between receiving advice and having the power to obey it. Drink water, but water access may be limited. Stay cool, but the home may be hot. Avoid outdoor work, but wages may depend on it. Check on neighbors, but communities may be fragmented. Seek medical care, but transport may be disrupted. Use cooling, but electricity may be expensive. Open windows at night, but the street may be unsafe. Move to shade, but the route may not have any. That gap is where preventable harm grows. Europe's heat crisis, therefore, cannot be solved only by forecasting better temperatures. Better forecasts are essential, but they are only the beginning. The real work is identifying who has no margin, who is alone, who is indoors but unsafe, who is working under compulsion, who lives in a building that traps heat, who depends on electricity they cannot afford, who will not understand the warning, who cannot reach the cooling center, who will appear in the statistics only after the heat has already done its work. When those questions are asked, the heat map changes. It is no longer only red across a region. It becomes a map of rooms, shifts, routes, wages, beds, roofs, sidewalks, and phone calls. It becomes a map of who gets protected first and who is expected to endure. That is the human layer under Europe's warming headline. The climate signal may arrive from the atmosphere, but the damage is filtered through society. Heat moves through walls, jobs, age, illness, language, income, mobility, and isolation. It finds the places where the system is thin. It finds the building that never cools, the worker who cannot stop, the patient who cannot regulate body temperature, the neighborhood without trees, the household afraid of the power bill, the city with advice but no operational plan. And that is why this moment is more dangerous than the number alone. The number can tell the continent that heat is rising. It cannot tell whether Europe is protecting the people standing at the edge of that rise. Only the system can answer that. The heat gap is the space between what the climate is now doing and what society is ready to absorb. It is not visible like a collapsed bridge. It does not appear as one broken pipe, one failed hospital, one stopped train, or one overloaded power line. It appears between systems. It appears when the weather service knows danger is coming, but the health system is not fully mobilized. It appears when a city sends a warning, but the most vulnerable residents cannot act on it. It appears when hospitals prepare for heat illness, but discharged patients return to homes that remain unsafe. It appears when workers are told to avoid strenuous activity, but the economy still expects them to deliver, harvest, build, clean, and care. This is why Europe's heat crisis has to be understood as systemic risk. A simple risk harms one place in one way. A systemic risk moves through connections. It does not stay where it begins. Heat begins in the atmosphere, but it travels through electricity demand, rail lines, river levels, hospital capacity, insurance costs, food production, labor productivity, school schedules, public budgets, household energy bills, social care, and political trust. The weather may be the trigger, but the damage is shaped by the system it enters. A continent can survive many shocks if they arrive separately. A hospital can handle more patients if the staff are rested, the building is safe, and the power is stable. A grid can handle higher demand if infrastructure is strong and supply is reliable. A transport network can handle delays if there are alternatives. A household can manage heat if the building cools at night and electricity is affordable. A city can protect vulnerable people if it knows where they are and has people ready to reach them. But heat does not always stress one system at a time. It can raise power demand while making workers less productive. It can increase hospital visits while staff are also sleeping poorly in overheated homes. It can slow trains while people are trying to reach cooling spaces, clinics, pharmacies, and relatives. It can dry soils while farmers are trying to protect crops and livestock. It can reduce river levels while energy systems, transport routes, and ecosystems depend on water. It can push families toward air conditioning while raising bills and stressing the grid. It can make schools unsafe while parents still have to work. It can make cities ask for solidarity at the exact moment when everyone is tired. That is systemic risk, not one failure, but many pressures arriving together. The most important thing about a heat health action plan is that it treats heat as a chain reaction, not as a forecast color. When it works, it connects institutions before the event becomes medical. It links meteorologists, public health agencies, hospitals, local governments, care homes, schools, employers, transport operators, community groups, and emergency services. It decides who does what, when they do it, and how the response escalates as danger accumulates. Without that coordination, the heat gap widens. A weather agency may issue an accurate warning, but accuracy alone does not cool a room. A health ministry may publish guidance, but guidance alone does not change a work shift. A city may open a cooling center, but a cooling center alone does not help an older person who cannot travel. A hospital may prepare internally, but a hospital alone cannot make thousands of apartments safe. Each institution can be doing something reasonable, and the whole system can still fail to protect the people most exposed. That is the uncomfortable truth of systemic risk. Partial action can look like preparedness until the heat arrives. The power grid is one of the clearest examples. Heat drives cooling demand. Cooling can save lives. But cooling depends on electricity, and electricity depends on generation, transmission, distribution, affordability, and backup systems. A wealthy household may respond to a heat alert by lowering the thermostat. A poorer household may hesitate because the bill matters. A hospital may need cooling not for comfort, but for safe care, operating rooms, medicines, equipment, and vulnerable patients. A care home may need reliable cooling for residents who cannot regulate temperature well. If demand surges and infrastructure is stressed, a heat event can become an energy event. That does not mean cooling should be rejected. It means cooling has to be planned as part of a resilient system. Europe's answer cannot be only more machines in more rooms. It has to include buildings that gain less heat, roofs that reflect more sunlight, windows that can be shaded, ventilation that works safely, urban trees placed where people need them, cool public spaces, strong grids, affordable energy, backup power for critical facilities, and targeted support for people whose lives depend on indoor cooling. Mechanical cooling is a tool, but if it becomes the only tool, the system becomes vulnerable to the next outage, the next price spike, or the next demand peak. Transport shows the same pattern. During extreme heat, transport is not only mobility, it is access to survival. People need buses, trains, sidewalks, elevators, and roads to reach clinics, cooling spaces, pharmacies, supermarkets, workplaces, and family members. If rail service is slow, if platforms become dangerously hot, if buses lack cooling, if roads soften, If lifts fail, if walking routes have no shade, then the heat response itself becomes harder to reach. A person may be told to go somewhere cooler, but the route there may be part of the hazard. This is why a cooling center cannot be judged only by its address. It has to be judged by the body trying to reach it. How far is the walk? Is there shade? Is public transport reliable? Is the building accessible to people with disabilities? Are pets allowed? If pets are the reason an older person refuses to leave home? Are people experiencing homelessness welcome? Are migrants informed in languages they understand? Are the hours aligned with the dangerous period, including evening and night? A public refuge that exists on paper can still fail in practice. Hospitals reveal another system boundary. A hospital can treat heat illness, but it cannot treat the climate alone. If emergency departments fill with heat-related problems, the hospital is already at the late end of the chain. The better response happens before arrival, in housing, public warnings, medication advice, social care, worker protection, and neighborhood outreach. Yet hospitals still have to prepare for the cases that come. They need cooling, staffing, triage plans, emergency supplies, communication with public health authorities, protection for staff, and safe discharge planning. Safe discharge becomes a climate question. A patient can recover in a cooled ward and then return to an apartment that remains dangerously hot. If there is no system to assess that risk, the hospital may release someone back into the conditions that contributed to the illness. In a warming Europe, the boundary between medical care and housing becomes thinner. The hospital bed and the bedroom are connected by the same heat wave. Schools and childcare centres are another part of the system. A child's exposure is managed by adults, buildings, schedules, transport, playground design, and family work patterns. If a school overheats, closing it may protect children inside the building, but it can create a new problem for parents who cannot stay home. If schools remain open, they need shade, water, ventilation, cooling strategies, modified activity, and staff trained to recognize symptoms. Heat policy is therefore not simply about education. It is about labor, family care, transport, child health, and inequality. The labor system may be the most politically difficult layer because heat forces a question that economies often avoid. When does work become unsafe? In a heat wave, the answer cannot be left only to personal judgment. Workers may need money, employers may face deadlines, crops may need harvesting, roads may need repair, tourists may expect service. Deliveries may continue because platforms keep functioning, but the body has limits that contracts cannot negotiate away. A serious heat plan has to include triggers for rest breaks, water, shade, schedule changes, protective equipment, worker education, and enforcement. Otherwise, public health advice stops at the edge of the workplace. Agriculture shows how heat connects health to food and water. Farmers and farm workers face direct exposure, but crops and livestock also respond to heat. Soil moisture, irrigation demand, animal welfare, harvest timing, and rural health access all become part of the same event. Heat can reduce yields, increase water stress, and force difficult choices about labor during narrow harvest windows. A city heat plan cannot simply be copied onto rural regions. The exposure is different, the distances are different, the work is different. The response has to be local enough to match the landscape. Water systems add yet another layer. Heat increases demand for drinking water, cooling, irrigation, cleaning, and public spaces. At the same time, drought conditions can reduce supply or strain ecosystems. Rivers matter for transport, power, industry, agriculture, and nature. When heat coincides with low water, the event becomes larger than temperature. It becomes a stress test of how societies allocate a resource that everyone assumes will be there. Insurance and public finance are quieter but powerful parts of the systemic story. Heat can damage infrastructure, reduce productivity, increase health costs, affect tourism, stress agriculture, and require emergency spending. Some costs are visible quickly, others accumulate slowly. Retrofitting buildings, planting and maintaining urban trees, upgrading hospitals, strengthening grids, changing work rules, expanding social care, improving data systems, and protecting vulnerable households. Thermal debt eventually becomes financial debt. If adaptation is delayed, the bill does not disappear, it moves forward. But money alone is not enough. Governance matters. A heat plan has to decide responsibility before the crisis. Who has authority to activate alerts? Who communicates with hospitals? Who contacts care homes? Who checks on older residents? Who coordinates transport to cooling spaces? Who monitors workplace safety? Who gathers data on illness and deaths? Who updates the plan after each event? Who pays for the measures that do not fit neatly into one department? Heat crosses boundaries, but governments are often organized into separate boxes. The heat gap often lives between those boxes. This is why the phrase "new baseline" matters. A new baseline means the abnormal becomes frequent enough that institutions must stop treating it as exceptional. It does not mean every summer is equally catastrophic. It does not mean every region faces the same risk. It means the background conditions have shifted enough that planning based on the old climate becomes increasingly unreliable. In the old baseline, a severe heat wave could be treated as a rare emergency. In the new baseline, heat becomes a recurring operating condition. That changes the standard of preparedness. A city does not prepare for winter by improvising every time temperatures fall. Roads are salted, heating systems exist, shelters are planned, budgets are assigned. People know the season is coming. Heat now requires the same seriousness. Not panic, not permanent emergency. Seriousness. A society that knows heat will return has to build routines before it arrives. Surveillance, outreach, cooling access, building standards, labor protections, hospital protocols, transport adjustments, and public communication that reaches people in time. The European Environment Agency's finding on heat health action plans matters because it reveals that this routine is not yet universal. Across the EEA group, 21 of 38 countries have heat health action plans in place, and 4 more are developing them. Surveillance systems are also uneven. That means some parts of Europe have stronger institutional choreography than others. The climate signal may be continental, but the protection map is patchy. Patchiness is dangerous because heat does not respect administrative borders. People travel, workers migrate, tourists move, electricity crosses borders, food supply chains cross borders, river basins cross borders, smoke, ozone, drought stress, and heat patterns can span regions. A weak response in one place can affect another through hospitals, transport, labor, agriculture, or emergency services. A continent with shared systems cannot treat adaptation as only local charity. Local action is essential, but systemic risk requires coordination beyond the city and beyond the nation. The other danger is overload. Public institutions are already dealing with many pressures: aging populations, health workforce shortages, housing costs, energy transitions, migration, budget constraints, geopolitical stress, and disaster recovery from floods, fires, and storms. Heat enters that crowded room and demands attention. Because it is often invisible, it can be pushed down the list until a dangerous week forces it back up. But waiting for the emergency is exactly what makes the emergency more expensive. A mature heat response does not ask whether heat is the only threat. It recognizes that heat worsens other threats. Heat can worsen air pollution, it can worsen drought, it can amplify wildfire risk, it can stress mental health, it can reduce learning, it can lower productivity, it can increase conflict inside households and workplaces, it can make recovery from other disasters harder, it can push people who were barely coping into crisis. Heat is not always the loudest hazard, but it is one of the most efficient at finding weakness. That efficiency is what makes the heat gap so frightening. It does not require Europe to become unrecognizable overnight. It only requires the continent to keep relying on systems designed for a cooler operating range. A few degrees of baseline change, repeated across enough days, enough cities, enough bodies, enough infrastructure, and enough institutions, can turn ordinary weaknesses into emergencies. The future does not arrive as a single wall. It arrives as a pressure that makes the old margins disappear. And yet the same systemic view also shows where protection can be built. If heat moves through systems, then prevention can move through systems too. A forecast can trigger outreach. Outreach can prevent hospital visits. Better housing can reduce nighttime exposure. Shade can protect walkers. Labor rules can prevent collapse. Affordable electricity can keep high-risk households safe. Surveillance can reveal where harm is rising. Hospitals can coordinate with social care. Schools can adapt schedules. Cities can design cooler streets. National governments can fund local action. European institutions can compare, learn, and standardize what works. The chain reaction can run in both directions. A missing plan allows heat to become injury, illness, disruption, and death. A working plan turns the same forecast into earlier warnings, cooler rooms, changed shifts, checked neighbors, prepared hospitals, safer transport, and fewer bodies pushed to their limit. The atmosphere may set the hazard, but the system shapes the outcome. That is the point of calling this a continental systemic risk. It is not to make the story larger for drama, it is to name the scale at which the problem actually operates. Europe's fastest warming status is a climate fact. The missing heat plans are a governance fact. The people in overheated homes, jobs, hospitals, and streets are the human fact. Put together, they describe a continent whose climate baseline has moved faster than its protective routines. The heat gap is not only the space between temperature and comfort, it is the space between warning and action, between science and policy, between national plans and local streets, between hospital care and unsafe homes, between public advice and private capacity, between a climate that has already changed and institutions still deciding whether heat is an emergency or background noise. That gap is now one of Europe's defining risks. And every summer that arrives before it is closed will test not only how hot the continent becomes, but how quickly it learns to protect life in a world where heat is no longer the exception. A serious heat story has to protect itself from two opposite mistakes. The first mistake is denial. It says the heat is only weather, only summer, only something Europe has always known, as if a changing baseline does not matter. That mistake ignores the observed warming, the repeated heat stress, the tropical nights, the mortality studies, and the warnings from climate and health agencies. The second mistake is overclaiming. It says every hot day, every fire, every hospital pressure, every death, every crop loss, every rail delay, and every power problem can be directly and simply assigned to climate change without further evidence. That mistake also weakens the story because it turns science into a shortcut. The truth is more powerful, but it is more disciplined. So the question has to be separated into parts. What can be said with confidence? What is likely connected? What may only be happening at the same time? What is not yet proven? And what is the real risk, even when every individual case cannot be named with certainty? Start with what is clear. Europe is warming rapidly. Copernicus and the World Meteorological Organization have described Europe as the fastest warming continent, with temperatures rising at about twice the global average rate in recent decades. That does not mean every European location warms at the same pace. It does not mean every day is hotter than the last. It means the long-term background has shifted upward. The climate floor has risen, and weather now plays out on that higher floor. It is also clear that extreme heat is a health hazard. Heat stress can lead to dehydration, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, cardiovascular strain, kidney stress, respiratory complications, cognitive impairment, workplace injuries, and death. This is not speculation. It is basic physiology confirmed by public health data. The body has limits. When exposure exceeds those limits, especially over long periods and warm nights, harm becomes more likely. It is also clear that vulnerability is uneven. Older people, infants, people with chronic illness, pregnant people, outdoor workers, socially isolated residents, people experiencing homelessness, low-income households, and people in poorly cooled housing are often at higher risk. The same heat does not land on everyone the same way. A forecast number becomes dangerous through age, health, housing, labor, money, mobility, and access to help. It is also clear that heat health action plans matter. WHO Europe recommends them because heat-related health impacts can often be prevented or reduced with planning. The European Environment Agency and Climate Adapt report that only 21 of 38 EEA countries have such plans in place, while 4 more are developing them. That is a real preparedness gap. It does not prove every death is caused by a missing plan, but it does show that the protective system is incomplete. Now comes the harder part: attribution. When a heat wave happens in a warming climate, the right scientific question is not usually, did climate change cause this event from nothing? Weather events have natural causes too. High pressure systems, wind patterns, soil moisture, ocean conditions, season, latitude, and local geography all matter. A heat wave can still be shaped by natural variability. The better question is, did human-caused climate change make this kind of event more likely, more intense, longer, or more dangerous? For many extreme heat events, attribution science has found that human-caused warming increases probability and intensity. That is consistent with the larger assessment from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, and has contributed to changes in many climate extremes. But an honest script should not pretend that every local heat episode has already been individually studied. Some events have formal attribution studies. Others do not. Some links are strong, others require more data. That distinction is not weakness, it is the discipline that keeps the investigation credible. A single hot day in Paris, Madrid, Berlin, Athens, Warsaw, or London does not by itself prove the entire climate crisis. Weather has always produced hot days, but when hot days occur within a documented long-term warming trend, when heat stress days increase, when tropical nights become more common, when the hottest years cluster in the recent record, and when health systems repeatedly warn about heat risks, the pattern is no longer innocent. One day is weather, the rising pattern is climate. That sentence matters because it prevents both denial and exaggeration. It allows one hot afternoon to remain one hot afternoon while still recognizing that the background odds are changing. A loaded dice can still roll a low number sometimes. A warming climate can still produce cool weeks. Rain can still fall during a drought-prone period. A cold spell can still occur on a hotter planet. None of that cancels the trend. It is also important not to confuse hazards that occur together. A heat wave may happen during a drought. A wildfire may happen during a hot period. Air pollution may worsen during stagnant weather. A hospital may face pressure during the same week as a heat alert. These events can be connected, but the connection has to be demonstrated. Heat can dry vegetation and increase fire weather risk, but a specific fire may also depend on ignition, wind, land management, fuel load, response time, and topography. Heat can increase power demand, but a specific outage may depend on grid condition, maintenance, supply, equipment failure, or market stress. Heat can worsen health outcomes, but an individual death may involve multiple medical factors. The honest story does not erase complexity, it shows how complexity works. This is especially important for deaths. Heat-related mortality is often estimated through population-level analysis, comparing observed deaths with expected deaths during heat periods. That method can reveal a large public health burden that would otherwise remain hidden. But it does not mean every individual death certificate will say heat as the only cause. Heat often acts as an amplifier. It pushes fragile bodies past thresholds. It worsens heart disease, kidney disease, respiratory disease, and other conditions. It can be the pressure that makes an existing vulnerability fatal. That is why heat deaths can be both real and difficult to see. The absence of a dramatic label does not mean the absence of heat impact, but the presence of heat nearby does not automatically prove heat was the decisive cause in every case. Both statements are true. The science has to hold them together. Another false shortcut is to say that Europe's problem is simply that people are careless. That is not adequate. Individual behavior matters. Drinking water, avoiding exertion, checking on neighbors, using shade, and seeking cooler spaces can save lives. But behavior sits inside conditions. A person cannot stay cool in a room that never cools. A worker cannot avoid outdoor labor without job protection. A homeless person cannot stay indoors without indoors. A low-income household cannot use cooling freely if electricity is unaffordable. An older person cannot respond to a warning they never receive, do not understand, or cannot act upon. So the real risk is not that Europeans do not know summer can be hot. The real risk is that the climate hazard is becoming more frequent and intense, while the social ability to respond remains uneven. Another misleading claim would be that wealthy countries are automatically safe. They are not. Wealth can buy protection, but only if it is distributed, planned, and maintained. A country can have advanced hospitals and still have unsafe housing. It can have satellites and forecasts, but weak local outreach. It can have air conditioning in some homes and energy poverty in others. It can have climate strategies, but no operational heat plan reaching the most exposed residents. Development changes vulnerability. It does not abolish it. It would also be wrong to say that heat plans alone solve the problem. They do not. A plan cannot stop the atmosphere from warming. It cannot replace emissions reduction. It cannot instantly retrofit housing, plant mature trees, rebuild hospitals, redesign labor law, or eliminate poverty. A heat health action plan is a critical defense, but it is not the whole fortress. It is the operating system that coordinates immediate protection while deeper adaptation and mitigation are built. This distinction matters because Europe faces two timelines at once. The first timeline is emergency response. Warnings, outreach, cooling spaces, hospital readiness, worker protections, school adjustments, and care for vulnerable people during the next heat event. The second timeline is structural change, cutting greenhouse gas emissions, redesigning cities, upgrading buildings, strengthening grids, reducing energy poverty, improving healthcare resilience, and changing how work is organized in hot seasons. Confusing these timelines creates false choices. Europe needs both. There is also a claim that must be handled carefully, that the future is already lost. The evidence does not support fatalism. Heat risk is rising, but outcomes are not fixed. Planning can reduce deaths. Outreach can reach isolated people. Better buildings can lower indoor heat. Shade can reduce street exposure. Labor rules can prevent collapse. Surveillance can reveal danger earlier. Hospitals can prepare. Public communication can improve. Emissions reductions can limit how much worse future warming becomes. The hazard is growing, but the damage is still shaped by decisions. That is why the strongest conclusion is not panic. It is responsibility. The proven facts are enough. Europe is warming fast. Heat is dangerous to health. Warm nights and long duration matter. Vulnerable groups face higher risk. Many impacts can be prevented. Preparedness is incomplete. Human-caused climate change is loading the background toward more heat extremes. Not every individual event can be simplified into one cause, but the pattern is clear enough to demand action. The real danger is not uncertainty. The real danger is using uncertainty as an excuse to wait. Science will continue to refine attribution. Researchers will study individual events, improve mortality estimates, map urban heat more precisely, and measure which interventions save the most lives. That work matters, but Europe does not need perfect certainty about every local case before protecting people from a known hazard. A doctor does not wait for every molecular pathway to be mapped before cooling a patient in heat stroke. A city should not wait for every statistical detail before checking on isolated residents during a heat alert. This is the line the story has to hold. Do not claim what cannot be claimed. Do not weaken what is already known. Do not turn every coincidence into causation. Do not let complexity become denial. The truth is not that every hot day proves everything. The truth is that a fast-warming continent with incomplete heat plans is exposing more people, more often, to a hazard whose mechanisms are understood and whose worst outcomes are often preventable. That is enough to be alarming, and it is enough to act. The first image was a continent entering another heat season with a strange contradiction hanging over it. Europe is the fastest warming continent on Earth, yet the systems meant to protect people from dangerous heat are still incomplete. That contradiction is not an abstract policy problem. It is not a line buried inside a technical report. It is a bedroom that stays hot after midnight. It is a hospital preparing for patients before a city has fully reached the people at risk. It is a worker stepping onto asphalt that has already absorbed yesterday's heat. It is a care home trying to keep fragile bodies stable while the building itself becomes part of the hazard. That is where this story has been leading. Not to the idea that Europe is helpless, not to the idea that every summer will be a catastrophe, not to the claim that one hot day proves everything. The evidence is more specific, and therefore more serious. Copernicus and the World Meteorological Organization have identified a continent warming at about twice the global average rate. Public health agencies have described heat as a major and often preventable health risk. The European Environment Agency has shown that heat health action plans are still not universal across the EEA countries. The science does not need exaggeration. The warning is already strong enough. The central message is this: the disaster is not only in the thermometer, the disaster is in the gap. The gap between a warning and a person who can act on it. The gap between a forecast and a hospital protocol. The gap between national climate language and a city worker opening a cooling center at the right hour. The gap between advice to stay cool and a rented room that never cools. The gap between telling people to avoid outdoor work and an economy that still pays them only if they continue. The gap between knowing the climate has changed and rebuilding institutions as if that knowledge matters. That gap is the heat gap. It is one of the most important climate risks in Europe because it turns a physical hazard into a social test. Heat does not strike a blank surface. It enters a continent full of old buildings, aging populations, dense cities, labor pressures, strained hospitals, energy costs, transport networks, social isolation, and unequal access to cooling. It moves through the places where daily life is already tight. It finds the person with no spare money, no spare health, no spare sleep, no spare room, no spare worker, no spare hospital bed, no spare bus route, no spare plan. That is why the phrase, fastest warming continent, cannot remain a climate statistic. It has to become a governance question. A statistic can say the baseline is changing. Governance decides whether people are protected from what that change does. A statistic can show the trend. Governance decides whether buildings are retrofitted, whether heat alerts trigger action, whether workers have enforceable protections, whether care homes have cooling protocols, whether cities plant shade where people actually walk, whether hospitals can remain safe during peak demand, whether vulnerable residents are contacted before the ambulance is needed. The future will not judge Europe only by what it knew. It will judge Europe by what it did after knowing. There is a temptation, after every heat wave, to let the danger fade when the weather changes, the sky clears, the evening becomes pleasant again. News cameras move to floods, fires, elections, markets and wars. Restaurants refill. Tourists return. Offices reopen. A city that seemed under pressure begins to look normal. The heat emergency appears to have passed. But that appearance can be misleading. A heat wave ends in the forecast before it ends in the system. Hospitals may still be treating the consequences. Families may still be grieving. Workers may still be recovering. Buildings may still carry heat. Public agencies may still be counting deaths that were not obvious at the time. Researchers may later reveal the true mortality burden. And, more quietly, the next summer is already moving closer. This is the rhythm that makes heat so dangerous. It arrives, it strains, it leaves, and then it returns. Each return asks whether the previous lesson was stored as memory or converted into protection. Europe already has proof that protection is possible. Heat deaths are not random lightning strikes. Many can be prevented. Early warnings can work. Outreach can work. Cooling spaces can work when they are accessible. Better housing can work. Shade can work. Hydration and rest can work. Labor protections can work. Clinical guidance can work. Surveillance can work. Neighbor checks can work. Public communication can work when it is clear, trusted, multilingual, and linked to real options. None of these measures is science fiction. They are known tools. But known tools do not save lives by existing in reports. They save lives when they become routines. When someone knows exactly when to activate a plan, when a city knows which neighborhoods will overheat first, when a care service has a list of people who need calls or visits, when a hospital knows the heat alert is not background noise but a signal for staffing and triage, when an employer knows the workday must change before bodies fail, when a school knows that a hot classroom is not only uncomfortable but unsafe, when a transport authority knows that shade and service reliability are part of public health. A heat plan is not paperwork, it is choreography. It is the choreography of survival under conditions that used to be rare and are becoming more familiar. It tells institutions how to move before panic begins. It turns climate science into operational timing. It turns a weather forecast into open doors, change shifts, phone calls, shaded routes, staffed clinics, prepared ambulances, checked apartments, cooled wards, and fewer people left alone with the heat. The absence of that choreography does not always look dramatic. It can look like delay. It can look like confusion. It can look like advice without transport. It can look like a cooling center nobody vulnerable reaches. It can look like a worker continuing because the rules are vague. It can look like a family learning too late that a warm night was dangerous. It can look like a death certificate that names the final medical condition, but not the heat that helped push the body there. That is why this story is not only about climate change, it is about translation. Can Europe translate climate knowledge into public health action quickly enough? Can it translate satellite data into neighborhood decisions? Can it translate warnings into protection for people without money, mobility, language access, or social support? Can it translate the painful lessons of 2003 and later deadly summers into a system strong enough for the next baseline? Can it translate the idea of adaptation from a policy document into the ordinary architecture of life? Because adaptation is not one thing. It is the room that stays livable at night. It is the street with shade where people wait for the bus. It is the power grid that can support safe cooling. It is the hospital that does not become another heat trap. It is the care worker with enough time to check on residents. It is the employer who changes the schedule because the body has limits. It is the school that protects children before symptoms begin. It is the city that knows heat risk is not distributed by temperature alone, but by housing, age, illness, work, isolation, and income. And mitigation still matters. A strong heat plan can reduce deaths during the next dangerous week, but it cannot by itself stop the long rise in the baseline. Cutting greenhouse gas emissions remains essential because every fraction of additional warming increases the load future systems must carry. Adaptation protects people from heat already arriving. Mitigation limits how far that heat can go. Treating them as rivals is another false choice. Europe needs both because the body needs protection now, and the future needs a lower ceiling of risk. This is the sober part of the conclusion. No plan can make Europe immune to heat. No warning can remove all loss. No city can retrofit every building overnight. No hospital can prevent every emergency. A warming climate means some risk will rise even under serious preparation. But the difference between an unavoidable hazard and a preventable tragedy is often measured in decisions made before the dangerous day. The heat will come. The question is whether it finds a system awake. That question will return again and again. It will return in a warm night when an apartment refuses to cool. It will return in a hospital corridor when staff see the first pattern of heat illness. It will return on a construction site when the schedule says continue but the body says stop. It will return in a schoolyard without shade. It will return at a bus stop on a treeless street. It will return in a care home where every resident depends on the building, the staff, the power supply, and the plan. It will return when a city sends an alert and discovers whether that alert is a message or a mechanism. The opening image now looks different. At first, it was a continent warming fast while plans were missing. By the end, it is something more precise, a continent being asked to close the distance between knowledge and protection. Europe has the satellites, it has the agencies, it has the mortality studies, it has the memory of past heat disasters, it has examples of action that can save lives. What it does not yet have everywhere is a complete protective system scaled to the speed of the change. That is the unfinished part. A heat wave will pass, temperatures will fall, the red maps will disappear from screens, streets will look ordinary again, but the thing exposed by the heat will remain. The old assumption that Europe's climate is mild enough for improvisation is breaking. The old assumption that wealth automatically protects is breaking. The old assumption that heat is a seasonal inconvenience rather than a public health threat is breaking. The old assumption that warnings are enough is breaking. Something else has to replace those assumptions. Not fear for its own sake, not fatalism, not the theatrical language of an apocalypse that leaves people numb. What has to replace them is a harder form of realism, the realism that says heat is now infrastructure, heat is housing, heat is healthcare, heat is labor, heat is transport, heat is energy, heat is urban design, heat is social isolation, heat is data, heat is governance, and because heat is all of those things, protecting people from heat cannot be assigned to the weather forecast alone. The thermometer will keep telling part of the story. It will tell when the air is hotter than expected. It will tell when the afternoon becomes dangerous. It will tell when records fall. But the thermometer will not tell who has no shade. It will not tell who is alone. It will not tell which hospital is near capacity. It will not tell which worker cannot stop. It will not tell which apartment is hotter inside than outside. It will not tell which country has a plan that works and which one has advice without machinery behind it. For that, Europe has to look beyond the number. It has to look at the room, the street, the ward, the grid, the school, the care home, the workplace, the bus route, the power bill, the city budget, the national plan, and the person whose body becomes the final sensor of whether the system worked. That is the final image this story leaves behind, not a burning horizon, but a quiet room after midnight, still too warm, with someone inside, depending on decisions made far beyond that room. The event will pass. The lesson should not. Europe is not doomed because it is warming fast, but it is being tested because it is warming fast while protection remains uneven. The next dangerous heat season will not ask only how high the temperature climbs. It will ask a deeper question. When the heat returns, what will Europe have chosen to protect before the first body fails?